Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Harper Lecture, Socially Responsible Corporate Governance, featuring Professor Luigi Zingales. I'm Andrea Hodgman, Associate Director for Intellectual Engagement and Travel for Alumni Relations and Development, and I'm the Program Manager for the Harper Lecture Series. I am so pleased to see how many of you have joined us since we've gone virtual. On behalf of everyone at the UChicago Alumni Office, thank you. Before we begin, I'd like to make a couple of housekeeping notes. There will be 3 people speaking today. You will hear me, Professor Zingales, and our moderator, Professor Robert Gertner. Everyone else will be muted. However, we would like you to participate by asking questions. To do that, just type a question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time during the talk. If you have issues with audio, you may want to shut down programs running in the background or dial in from your telephone. Our presentation will last for 60 minutes. Professor Zingales will speak, and then we should have about 20 minutes for questions from you. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available to you on the Harper Lecture YouTube channel. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Professor Robert Gertner. Professor Gertner has been on the Chicago Booth faculty since 1986. His research interests include strategic decision-making, corporate finance, organization structure, theory of the firm, and social enterprises. He has published papers in numerous journals, including the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Review of Economic Studies, and the Yale Law Journal. He is co-author with colleagues Douglas Baird and Randy Picker of Game Theory and the Law. Professor Gertner teaches courses in strategic decision-making, social entrepreneurship, and impact investing. Welcome, Professor Gertner.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Rob Gertner, the Joel F. Gemunder Professor of Strategy and Finance at Chicago Booth and the John Edwardson Faculty Director of the Restandi Center for Social Sector Innovation. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Luigi Zingales, the Robert C. McCormick Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at Chicago Booth. Luigi's research interests extend from corporate governance to financial development, from political economy to the economic effects of culture. He co-developed the Financial Trust Index, which is designed to monitor the level of trust that Americans have toward their financial system. In addition to his position at Chicago Booth, Luigi is a faculty research fellow for the National Bureau of Economic Research, a research fellow for the Center for Economic Policy Research, and a fellow of the European Governance Institute. In 2014, he was president of the American Finance Association. In 2015, he became the director of the George J. Stigler Center at the University of Chicago, which he has refocused on promoting and diffusing research on regulatory capture and the various distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. I have had the pleasure of being Luigi's colleague for over 25 years. He is an incredibly creative and innovative thinker. He also has great skill and passion for impacting the debate over policy issues that relate to his research and the broader research mission of the Stigler Center. Today's talk will surely be a great example of all of this. Luigi, the remote and metaphorical floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you for your very kind words. You know, Chicago tends to be a pretty tough place. So the only time that you get your colleagues to say something nice about you is generally when you're dead. So this is a very much a nice change, and the fact that I get your compliments even before I'm passed away. So it's very appropriate to have a discussion today about corporate governance, and particularly the role of a socially responsible corporate governance, because in a few days is actually the 50th anniversary of the publication in the New York Times of a very famous piece by Milton Friedman, in which he asserted that the only social responsibility of business is to make profits. And I want to advertise the fact that the Dean's Office, in collaboration with the Stigler Center, will have an international panel that goes around the world from Hong Kong to London to Chicago. And then the Stigler Center will have a conference on these issues in September. But in preparation for that, I want to sort of discuss with you a bit what has been the traditional Chicago view of corporations for the last 50 years, and how, to some extent, this view, even in Chicago, has changed, and why has changed, and what does it imply for today's debate on corporate governance. So let me outline very quickly what is the traditional Chicago view. Probably most of you have been exposed in one form or another to these ideas. So I'm going to be very fast, but I think it's important to set the stage. So the first idea is that firms are just simply nexus of contracts. This is Mike Jensen, who was actually a classmate of Jim Farmer, a PhD from Chicago, say that there's nothing ominous about the power of corporation because corporations are simply a nexus of contract. And in part, this idea comes from the work of Alshan and Demsetz. Demsetz at the time was a professor at Chicago, in which he makes this point even more clear that the firm has no power of fiat, no authority, no disciplinary action, any different in the slightest degree from ordinary market contracting between two people. So whether I fire my employee or I stop buying tickets from United Airlines doesn't make any difference, because when I stop buying tickets at United Airlines, I'm de facto firing United Airlines. And this view is so prevalent that a colleague of Rob and myself use routinely the sense I fire United when he decided to start using American Airlines. And of course, the apex of all this debate was the position of Milton Friedman that say that corporations should conduct the business in accordance with their stockholders' desire, which generally will be to make as much money as possible, while of course conforming to their basic rules of society, both those embodied in the law and those embodied in ethical customs. So, and he concludes, the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And in other passages of the same thing, he said the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. So before I go and start criticizing one aspect of what Friedman was about, I want to make sure that everybody understands, first of all, that this is I don't want to fall into a mischaracterization of what Friedman said, because I think that his view is much broader than his enemies seem to suggest. And two, how important this idea is for today's world, starting from the way companies are run to the way actually endowments and asset management firms are run. So it's very important to say that in Friedman's view, is not that corporations should ignore workers and their desires. In fact, it would be completely consistent with Friedman's principle that Google, for example, stop doing business with the Pentagon because his workers don't want to do business with the Pentagon, and will only do that in a economic calculus looking at the cost of hiring workers that dislike working for the Pentagon versus the cost of hiring workers that don't mind working with the Pentagon, and in the comparison they decide what is best from a profit maximization point of view. And the same is true for customers. If customers don't like to buy tuna that is fished by killing dolphins, they will be prepared to pay a higher price for tuna that is environmentally safe. And as a result, if I am a manager of a company and I maximize profits, I pay attention to the need of my customers to the extent that my customers have a preference and they exert this preference by paying a different amount. And of course, as I mentioned, I should ignore the law, nor should I ignore the customs of my community. And also, I can have strategic objectives. What is completely consistent to Friedman, even if something that I don't particularly like, but it is completely consistent with Friedman, the fact that, for example, a company does some charity work in order to create some positive attitude in society, so that next time they do something wrong, for example, comes oil spills with oil corporations, then they are better treated by the political system. So all of this is absolutely in Friedman. And the way you should think about Friedman is an application of the very American principle of no taxation without representation. So his view is simply, at the end of the day, who pays for charity, who pays for doing action that are not in the profit maximizing goal. These are the shareholders who are the ultimate residual claimants. As a result, they are taxed, and you don't want them to be taxed without being represented. And I think that this sound principle is very important. Now, one of the important application of this Friedman principle is what I call the Friedman separation idea, is the fact that if you are a fund manager, even if you are managing the money for the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, tell me the most charitable foundation you want to think about, you only look at the goal of maximizing the return on your endowment, and then you're going to spend the money to do so. Okay, sorry, and then that money will be spent to do charity, etc. And the idea is the more money I make by maximizing profits, the more money is available for charity, and so the better the world is. Okay. Now, every result is based on some assumptions. So let's review the assumptions that are underlying the Friedman principle. The first one is that companies should be run in the interest of shareholders. I think this is a debated topic, especially in Europe. I think that in the United States is also debated, but there was a relatively recent Supreme Court of Delaware decision in 2010 saying that it is pretty clear that if you choose to do a for-profit corporation, you have to take care of the shareholders who are going to receive that profits. And you have the option creating a company to create any kind of company, benefit corporation, not-for-profit, so on and so forth. Once you choose a incorporated form in the for-profit, then you have some responsibility, and this is toward the shareholder. So I will not touch this assumption. The second assumption, which is very important, and in Capitalism and Freedom, actually, Friedman discusses how crucial this assumption is that companies operate in a competitive market. Now, unfortunately, we're in a world in which more and more companies are not operating in a competitive market. This creates a lot of distortions. This is an important topic, still a topic I will not discuss today, but is something is very dear to my heart. The third one is that shareholders care only about money. If you remember the statement that I quoted from Friedman, Friedman says that most of the time is only care about money. Now, he is very careful to say that maybe shareholders do care about something else. However, if 3 does not hold, then his conclusion is it doesn't really matter, because the best thing for a company to do is that you maximize profits, and then with those profits, you give those profits to the shareholders who can donate to their favorite charity. And so if the only form of social responsibility, if you want, if the only action we're going to talk about today is corporate charity, Milton Friedman is absolutely right. Why? Because it's efficient to have a company maximizing profits and then giving the money to the shareholders donate to their favorite charity. Since the shareholders tend not to agree what their favorite charity is, they value more the ability to donate to their own charity than the donation done by the corporation. So it's strictly superior to maximize profits and donate to individuals. So what is wrong with Friedman idea? Let's first of all, it is important to recognize that investors don't care only about money. And here we'll provide one piece of evidence. There is plenty of this evidence, but I want to provide a piece of evidence that is actually very related to the task we are discussing, which is portfolio management and the way corporations should be run. So these are three fellows that recently conducted a field experiment with the Dutch pension fund. It was a fairly small pension fund, but these pension funds really, the beneficiary of this pension fund depended on the return on their endowment. So if the return was lower, they will have either less pension, or they will be asked to contribute more for their retirement. And so these people are really residual claimant of the pension fund, and they've been asked, because the pension fund were discussing what to do, they were asked whether you want to engage more in socially responsible activity and sustainable investment. And 67.9% of the participants said we want more sustainable investment. Now, what is interesting, because words are cheap, what is interesting is it was made clear that this will come at a cost for the participants. And even then, the majority of the participants were in favor of more sustainable investments when this implied a lower return. Okay, so that's a piece of evidence that investors care not only about money, but about something else. Now, as I told you, if investors care about money, but the assumption number 4 in the list I provided before holds, i.e. that there is this ability to distribute the profits and undo at the company, at the individual level, what the company could have done at the corporate level, then this assumption that investors care is irrelevant. However, there are many, many situations in which the assumption number 4 does not hold. So think about this. It's much cheaper not to pollute than pollute and clean up. So it's not true that a company should maximize profits by polluting, then taking those profits, distribute it to the shareholders, and then the shareholders use that money to undo the pollution. And the same is true, this is a very US-based example, but the same is true for example, assault weapons. It's very costly to prevent massive shooting. One way to do it is to reduce the sale of AK-47. So if you are Walmart, and if you are Walmart shareholders, you might want to prevent this at the corporate level, and this is cheaper than done at the individual level. And this applies also to other phenomena. For example, we know that many of the companies we invest in through our funds are making money selling army to the Saudi that are massacring people in Yemen. And so you could say you want to maximize profits, then distribute that money, and then with that money we help people in Yemen. It seems that it's much more efficient to try to reduce the sale of guns to begin with. So in all the situations, it is more efficient for companies to adopt the shareholders' social objective, such as protecting the environment, than to maximize profits and we distribute the proceeds. So the conclusion that Oliver Hart and I had in a paper a few years back is that corporate boards should maximize shareholder welfare, not value, where welfare is your monetary return, but also everything else that enters in your utility function. Now, this logic, we play the logic in the terms of the shareholders, but this logic applies also to other stakeholders. So if I am an employee, it might be cheaper not to pollute than pollute and clean up. So it's not efficient to pay the workers the most or charge the consumer the least, and then let them use the extra money to enhance their social causes. But this poses a similar problem. Who gets to decide what the social causes are worth pursuing? Now, I would be very clear to say that I don't think that the Business Roundtable has any business in doing that. Now, last year, exactly almost to this day today, they issue a statement saying what they think their sort of goal of the corporation should be. And it's a funny situation because they should be an agent for us investors, shareholders, but they decide what to pick their goal is going to be. So I don't think that is their role, especially because they are very competent in business decision. That's the reason why they are selected, but they're not very competent in social trade-off decisions. The Friedman principles still apply. We don't want taxation without representation, so we want some representation. So in a free society, we want investors, consumers, and workers able to influence these decisions. But the question is how? And in a very famous book, Hirschman distinguishes two ways in which a member of a society can express or influence the way society is run. The first one is exit. So this is to say, I stop buying, I don't work for you, or I don't invest in your company. And that goes under the term of exit. Or voice, which is to express dissatisfaction, and in the case of a corporation, and if you are shareholders, also to vote in one way or another. So in what I'm going to do today is I'm going to summarize the result of a paper that is brand new. It actually came out in the NBR Working Paper Series today, in which with Oliver Hart and Leonora Borcado, we try to analyze the trade-off between exit and voice in reaching this influence on corporations. The starting point, however, is I want to introduce something that will sound a little bit weird to many of our older alumni, but is becoming increasingly an important feature of works in economics. And this is the idea that agents can be altruistic. So consider sort of atomistic investors. So consider people like me, who has some money in the retirement fund, but is not a large investor in any company whatsoever. Okay? If I'm purely selfish, so I'm only care about money, I should not have any interest in any social responsibility. Why? Think even about pollution. Pollution affects everybody, but the direct impact on me of the impact of the decision I make on the corporation I own through my vote or through my divestment is so small that doesn't make a difference. So I'm sure that through my S&P index, I own a little bit of U.S. Steel, and U.S. Steel actually end up polluting Hyde Park indirectly. But I am affected by this. But whatever I do on U.S. Steel, multiply what U.S. Steel does on me is such a small thing that I can't expect to have an impact. And this is the so-called free rider problem. To get around this limitation, what we assume is that at least some agents are partially altruistic in the sense described by those pensioners, that they care about the aggregate social welfare. So let me give you a very concrete and timely example. So in making my decision, an altruistic individual puts a weight lambda on the aggregate welfare function, and that lambda reflects the degree of altruism. So consider, for example, the decision to wear a mask when this is not mandatory. Now, we know that masks mostly protect others from us, not the other way around. So imagine that there is a private cost. I don't like to wear a mask. I pay 10 in private cost. And imagine that because I don't spread the disease, there is a $50 of no social benefit of complying. In fact, an article on The Economist last week estimated exactly at $54 the social benefit of wearing a mask. Now, remember, if I'm a purely selfish individual, I'm not gonna wear a mask. Why? Because I don't care directly about the 50. I care only about my 10, and the probability that I get infected due to the fact I don't wear a mask is so small that is trivial, so I don't wear a mask. But if I am a socially conscious individual, I might be wearing a mask because I compare the private cost 10 with the social benefit of 50. And the social benefit is weighted by lambda. But as long as lambda is bigger than 1/5, so 0.2 in this example, I will comply. Now, if it's not, I will not. So you can go around and do your empirical evidence and saying, given how many people wear a mask, you can figure out how they are altruistic or not. So in this recent paper, we take that a fraction of individuals, and we don't specify how big this fraction is altruistic in the sense that a positive lambda. And while we do some experiment with a lambda equal to 0.2, we don't really take a stand on what lambda is. So you can be even a teeny tiny altruistic. And we studied the relative efficiency of exit versus voice in addressing a pollution externality. Now, pollution is simply for simplicity, but any pollution of public good or public bad will do the trick. So just to set up the stage, imagine that a firm generates a pollution externality equal to H. H is the dollar cost of the pollution they generate. And if the firm pays a cost D to adopt a clean technology, the pollution is eliminated. So we know that the ideal outcome, what we economists call first best, is that if H is less than D, so if it is more expensive to fix the pollution that they pollute, is optimal that all firms choose the dirty technology. If H is bigger than D, then all firms choose the clean technology. And so the question that we're going to try to address is, to what extent consumers or employees boycotting, investors divesting, or investors engaging can deliver a result and how much this result approaches this benchmark that we call the first best, because this is what a benevolent central planner, a very rare animal in the real world, a benevolent central planner in charge of this economy will do. So the first result that actually surprised us to some extent is how little exit works in doing the job. So even if, first of all, it's important to understand that exit is very similar, whether we look at it from a consumer point of view, from an employee's point of view, or from an investor point of view, okay? Why? Because basically at the end of the day, they all work by penalizing the company. So either you charge, you have to pay more for workers, because some workers don't want to work for you because they are socially responsible, they're altruistic, or you have to less revenues in selling your consumers, or you have less revenues in selling your shares. They all work through price, through markets in penalizing the company. And what we show is that even ignoring coordination problems, which are very important, exit produces a less than proportional effect in the economy. So imagine that 10% of the people are altruistic, you're going to get less than 10% of the firms becoming clean. So individuals pay a cost, but the benefit is much less satisfactory than what we expect. And the reason is very simple, because exit works through an impact on prices. But as long as there are people who are purely selfish, these guys are going to substitute. So is my favorite example is I divest from oil companies, and oil company shares drop in values. That's a fantastic opportunity for the Koch brothers to buy shares at a lower price. And so my selling of shares actually mostly benefit the Koch brothers, a little bit impact the environment. Why a little bit impact the environment? Because in the model, the elasticity of demand of the Koch brothers is not infinite. They are not perfectly well diversified. So by buying more shares, they are going to not compensate completely what I'm doing. And so still, I'm going to have a teeny tiny effect on the environment. But the first order effect is that I make the Koch brother richer. And of course, the magnitude of the response depends on the slope of the demand, whether this is demand for shares in the case of divestment, demand for consumers in the case of products, demand for workers in the case of employment. Now, what is even more damning is all these results, these depressing results, come from the perspective of an individual that doesn't care about what everybody else does, doesn't act in a sense in a optimizing way, but coordinate with others. Now, if we add the issue of coordinating, if we look at the marginal incentive to participate in an exit strategy, we find that there is no simple relationship between the individual incentives to participate and the social incentive to create clean funds. So in a sense, divesting or boycotting can lead too little or too much exit from a perspective of benevolent planner. And actually, my favorite example is a couple of years ago, United Airlines damaged a guitar of a famous singer, or a relatively famous Canadian singer. And in spite of the fact that the terms of agreement says that United is not responsible for the packages of a certain dimension, and in particular for musical instruments, he started to sue United Airlines, in particular posted a YouTube video, United Breaks Guitars, that became viral. And as a result, United had to respond in a massive way to this problem. This is a typical example of somebody that succeeds in being disproportionately influential vis-a-vis to what his claim is. And so I think that in particular, if we ignore social phenomenon like the YouTube video, what we can say is for reasonable level of altruistic parameters, we find that the equilibrium level of exit is generally zero unless the pollution is extremely harmful. So basically, in very simple terms, exit is not going to work unless two things, unless number one, there are enormous inefficiencies, and number two, you can make it a social phenomenon, and I will come back on this later on. So let's analyze the voice possibility. Now, what makes it more difficult to analyze voice is that exit is a fairly institution-free phenomenon. In fact, the boycotting has the longest tradition going back to the American Revolution. The US colonists boycott the British tea, all going back to Indian and the Mahatma Gandhi, or the Black and the Martin Luther King. All these cases are revolt that starts with a form of boycott. So boycott is fairly institution-free, it's very hard to block. Voice, on the other hand, is regulated in many, many ways. So it's very hard to measure voice in an abstract setting. But let's start first in a more abstract setting, and then we're going to go in more details. So the first one is, let's assume that shareholders are presented with a choice of whether the firm they own should be clean or dirty. Okay? And at the moment, I'm not going to tell you how this takes place, and I assume, which of course is crazy, but I assume that all shareholders know the parameter H and D in their decision making. Now, what is interesting here is that if I'm a shareholder, I realize that the only time my vote matters is when it's pivotal. And as a result, I will vote as if my vote were pivotal. So basically vote as the country depends on you. This is basically what Obama said in his speech at the Democratic Convention. This is what our shareholders do when they look at the problem. And a pivotal shareholders trade off the net social benefit of the clean technology, weighted by its parameter lambda, against own capital loss resulting from the choice of that technology. However, and it's important to understand that the non-social benefits is the equal to the reduced value of pollution for everybody, because remember, in the stuff that multiplies by lambda is the benefits of society at large. So I look at the benefit minus the cost. So I'm basically looking at H minus D for everybody, multiplied by lambda. And I compare that with what? I compare that with my capital loss. But if I am really a Chicago investor and I have my portfolio well diversified, my personal capital loss is negligible because I will hold only one share in United Steel. So imagine that the cost of United Steel is large, but for every single share is more, and I only own a share, so that's negligible. And so as long as my lambda is positive, so I don't need to be very altruistic. As long as my lambda is positive, the first effect, which is pollution, dominates the other effect. And so I, as a shareholder, will vote exactly like a benevolent planners will vote. So this result is very important from a practical point of view, because in the debate on corporate governance, it's often presumed that more shareholders should not be asked to vote on social issues. In fact, there is a lot of regulation that tries to prevent this from happening. And the argument is, number one, votes are uninformed. Number two, they are bad incentives. And what our paper is suggesting is not true that they don't have good incentives. In fact, they have the best incentives, better than a large shareholder, because even if I am the Gates Foundation and I have the best interests of society at large, when I look at the shares of United Steel, I own enough shares that I internalize a bit the cost of this pollution, the personal cost of pollution, while us diversified shareholders only look at the social cost. And that's what makes us the best sort of person to decide. So that's the very key message. Now, of course, you say, but that's crazy because we hardly know how to vote in presidential election. We hardly vote in presidential election. How could we possibly vote in all the corporate election, especially if we are well diversified, we own thousands of companies? How can we possibly do that? The answer is pretty simple. This is what mutual funds can do for us. Imagine that I launch a mutual fund that has as a marketing strategy the fact that I care about the environment. Okay? Then we show that all socially responsible agents will be willing to invest in a green fund that is committed to promote an environmental agenda if H is bigger than D. So if we think that in this moment the cost of pollution is larger than the cost of getting rid of pollution, then we're going to invest in this green fund. Otherwise, we will not. So we will do what the social optimal with a benevolent social planner would do. So in a sense, this is the ideal world, and the presence of intermediaries relaxes the informational burden that the option, the voice option imposes on investors. Now, you might still be confused and say, wait a minute, I know that there are thousands of mutual funds. How do I know how they vote? And the answer is, look at politics, because we have the same problem in politics. In a democracy, we don't know how our representative votes in every single decision. What we go is according to ideology. Ideology makes us predictable. I know that if I vote Republican, they're going to vote for less taxes. If I vote Democrats, they're going to vote for higher taxes. I think that's predictable. Now, can we measure a mutual fund ideology? And the answer is yes. Bolton and other people use a standard political economy model to extract ideology from the way mutual funds vote. So they look at the way they vote in every single decision. And from that vote, they extract what utility function leads them to vote that way. So I make the long story short, I want to show you this picture. This picture shows on 2 dimensions. The first dimension of our ideology is how disciplinarian you are. So the first dimension, the number one, is environmental. The second one, the y-axis, is disciplinarian. So you see that Glass Lewis, for example, is very disciplinarian, is very tough with management. BlackRock, much less so. Glass Lewis is fairly neutral on the environmental dimension. If you are a sort of loving, environmental, altruistic guy, you should invest all your money in Needham. If you hate those guys, you should invest in Calvert. Is better than politics, because in politics you have two parties. In the mutual fund world, you have many of them. Now, if you think that all this doesn't matter, think again, because many decisions these days are coming close to be approved. This is one decision that I care particularly, is about proposal of companies to disclose their lobbying effort. And in the last proxy season in the United States, on average, this decision reached 31% of the votes. And remember that the large guys like BlackRock and Vanguard did not vote in favor. If they did, this will pass. So this can really change the world if the voice is done in a very consistent way. Now, I'm running out of time, so I will be a little bit fast at the end. I will leave time for questions. But the first thing is, what is the biggest limitation of our analysis? Is we take social preference as given. So we miss important benefits of exit campaigns, the one that they create awareness, they create a bandwagon effect. And in that sense, exit strategy can be very effective. That's the example of United Breaks, Make It R. However, the fact that this strategy is successful in pressuring people into behaving in a certain way socially is not necessarily an indication that they lead to a good outcome, because these forces help highly motivated minority to achieve their success very often at the expense of what the majority of people do. So the fact you see some successes does not mean that this is good from a society point of view, might be very bad from a societal point of view. Now, conclusion, investors don't care only about money. In the last 50 years, we have ignored the social objectives of investors. And in part, the piece by Milton Friedman played a gigantic role in this. And so it's about time that we realize that we need to address this growing demand for other objectives besides money, which doesn't mean money is not an important objective, it's still very important, but there are other things on the margin. And what we argue is that letting shareholders vote is the best way to achieve this new objective. Now, as a little gift at the end of this presentation, I will give you a preview. As many of you know, I run a podcast that comes out every other week called Capital Isn't, in which I discuss many of these topics. And so if you like this presentation, you want to be updated on this stuff, you can listen to me regularly. Now, unfortunately, last July, I lost my co-host. And so I was in the process this summer of substituting the co-host and finding a new sort of logo. And so now, in exclusive for you, I will present the new logo and the new co-host. The new co-host is Bethany McLean, a very famous business journalist who exposed Enron for the first time. And this is my new logo, and I welcome suggestion and like or dislike. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luigi. That was great. Nice to see you talk about a paper hot off the press. So we have a number of questions. Some were submitted beforehand, some now. Others who watching. If you want to submit a question, just type them into Q&A. So there are a number of questions which sort of get to the practical side of this. So one, I'll just give you a few and then you might want to answer them together. One says, one investor's social responsibility is another investor's waste of money. How does a board of directors balance this phenomenon? And then somewhat also practical are questions about how does this work if markets are really competitive so that the companies are facing lots of product market pressure and or markets for corporate control and things like that.
Okay, so both are very important questions. So the first one is, why don't we ask the shareholders what they want? If I am 100% shareholder in a teeny tiny company, I can spend the money the way I want, and I'm not forced to maximize profits. I might maximize profits, but I might also consider other factors. For example, the impact I have on the environment. I don't know why when we become public, all of a sudden, all the other objectives fall the wayside, and the only objective that remains is to maximize profits. Actually, I do know that why. It is because that's much, much simpler, okay? And the person who asked this question, I think probably hint to this, is the fact that it's very easy to agree on a common strategy if the only objective is to maximize profits. The moment you have other objectives, shareholders might disagree. But the beauty of it is, number one, they can sort themselves out. Not every company should behave the same way. And number two, I think that we go in the way we go in many other sort of social decision, which is a majority voting. And so I think that through a vote, we can communicate to the directors what they want. And if you say this is complicated, I say actually not that much, because there are plenty of examples. I showed just that example there on disclosure about lobbying activity, but there are a lot of proposals that are presented basically yearly to shareholders meeting, and they come close to get a majority, but not there yet. And some of these proposals are, for example, to ban the sale of assault weapon, or to ban some products that are particularly polluting, or sometimes to do a more thorough cost-benefit analysis from an environmental point of view of what the stuff is. So one of the motivators of this paper is that I did a case study about DuPont. Now, as many of you, especially if you're Americans, know, DuPont is one of the most blue-blooded and environmentally conscious companies that America has, okay? But thanks to a trial, we found that in 1984, they did a cost and benefit analysis, and they showed that was in their economic interest to pollute the Ohio River with this PFOA, which is a substance that is basically used to produce Teflon, that is killing a lot of people to these days. And what is scary is we took the numbers they apply and then basically said, let's do the calculation whether from an ex ante perspective was worth it. And even factoring in all the fines they pay, if you say that they did not have 100% probability of being caught, which is very hard to imagine, it was in their interest to pollute. So, and this was not, to be fair, was not done at the board level, was done at the lower level, but there was somebody sitting down in an office in Delaware that was comparing how many people I killed. They didn't do exactly how many people I killed, but they knew exactly that this was dangerous. So how much I pollute, how much it costs me to reduce pollution, I should go ahead. And what I'm asking is, in that situation, I want my company to actually factor in the death they generate. And I am not a bloody extremist, bleeding heart, sorry, no blood, bleeding heart liberal that say that you should pay any cost to avoid any death. We know that many economic activity, including driving, cost death. However, we don't want to generate death that are completely unjustified just because people don't factor in the cost. So I think is possible to do it, and by voting you can do it. Now this brings the next question, which is very important: is how you do it in a competitive world. And that's the beauty of our analysis, because we are in a perfectly competitive world. And the answer is people are willing to bear the cost. Why? Because at least some of them are altruistic. So we are not in the style of literature that making money by doing good. Okay, if that's possible, great. And I let all the managerial consultants push this line, because this is a great line and gives you a lot of business. I have the privilege, because I'm in academia, that I'm not trying to get any business. So I'm telling you what I think is the truth, is that actually saving life costs money. And I'm saying we should pay for it. And ideally, we should pay for it through some form of regulation. However, regulation is far from perfect. And in some situation, actually companies actively work to bypass regulation. What I learned in the DuPont case is not that regulation was not there, is that DuPont spent the best resources in the world to actually block the impact of that regulation by hiring every EPA chief that was stepping down, by lobbying Congress, by manipulating the evidence. Now, what is beautiful about that case, and by the way, there is a movie made of that case, is called, I think, Dark Waters, that makes this case very effectively. But what is beautiful about that case is through disclosure, they were able to get a lot of communication that otherwise would not get, including by a accident, the email that their corporate lawyers were sending to his family. And so at the same time, you had the official corporate lingo, we are doing the perfect thing, and the email sent to his family, we are in trouble because we're doing something bad. The same person was saying at two faces at the same time. We want people not to be forced in that situation ever again. We don't want individuals, decent individuals. That corporate lawyer was not a serial killer, okay? But he ended up killing or aiding and abetting the killing of a lot of people. Why? Because was in a system that was only looking at profit maximization.
I think we're not going to have time for too many questions, but here's one. It's a little afield, but I'm really curious to see how you would answer this. And it certainly relates to Friedman's 1970 piece. Why do you believe that Friedman and others underestimated the amount of power and influence a corporation can exert on a society's social and political system?
It's actually a beautiful question. I wish I had an entire hour to answer this question. And actually, when I was preparing this presentation, I had the temptation to put up the ending page of the very famous book by Burl and Means on modern corporation and private property, where they make this forecast, very ominous forecast about the power of large corporations. So at the beginning, this was 1932, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was this ominous view about the power of corporations. By not the middle, but by the 70s, this view, at least in economics and later in society, had completely disappeared. Now we are back. And why that's the case? My claim is because during the middle part of the 20th century, at least in the United States, we had a very, very strong antitrust enforcement. And so companies were not that powerful. I actually read recently a piece by Jensen and Macklin, which is not the famous 1976 piece. is a very known, famous 1977 piece that was saying that the corporations as we know disappear under the pressure of regulation, blah, 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 blah. And I have to say that looking from the perspective of 1970, this was not a crazy idea. Remember, in 1972, we had the introduction of the EPA. In 1973, we had the price control and wage control introduced by a Republican president. In 1974, we had the regulation of OSHA. In a sense, corporations were really, really not powerful in the 70s. And that led to what I think the Chicago Revolution. And I think the Chicago Revolution at the time was right because corporations were too weak at the time. But you know, there's too much of a good thing. Now we overshot in the opposite direction and corporations are too powerful. And once again, my view is Chicago should come to the rescue.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question. There are a number of questions sort of about how do we go about implementing this. And I'm curious the extent to which you feel both, I know we have lots of viewers from outside the United States. So certainly in the US, whether or not there are sort of regulatory restrictions or whether this just takes some entrepreneurial folks to make this greater shareholder democracy work, or whether there are regulatory barriers. And to the extent that you can talk beyond the US, that would be wonderful in 3 minutes.
So first of all, I have to say this is one of the many areas these days where the rest of the world is more advanced, particularly Europe is more advanced than the United States. I think that many of these debates about there are institutions that are environmentally concerned, etc., is the standard. I think that very often they don't let their investors speak, but the Dutch example I brought is perfect in that dimension. So I think if I see this from a European perspective, I say you are ahead. The only thing you need to do is let your constituency vote, and let's try to make it simpler for them to understand what the ideology is, which, you know, is not easy even in a political setting, let alone in this setting, but I think that's the way to go. In the United States, as Rob anticipated, I think there is a huge regulatory barrier that makes very difficult for shareholders to express their opinion in what the SEC call ordinary business matter. So if pollution is an ordinary business matter, shareholders cannot vote a statement about pollution. And that really makes it very difficult for shareholders to be engaged. And I'm sorry to report that the SEC under Clayton, the current chairman, is trying to make this even more difficult. And my view, this is my personal view, is that that is happening because the shareholders are at the gate. The numbers I show you suggest that with a little bit more push, even in the United States, we are pretty close to actually changing the way companies are run. And many people don't want this to happen, and they resort to the very un-Republican and way to introduce regulation to prevent owners to express what they want. This is, to me, is the greatest contradiction in terms that a Republican administration is using regulation to squelch the voice of investors. But a ray of hope, an MBA, unfortunately from Stanford, nobody is perfect, but who actually was taught in class the previous paper that Oliver and I wrote, the 2017 paper, is starting as we speak a fund trying to sort of pursue some of this idea. So hopefully, as Gene Farmer pioneer with David Booth, index investing, we are going to pioneer environmental investing, at least in the United States.
Great. Thank you, Luigi. This is wonderful. I apologize to all of the folks who asked great questions that we were unable to get to, but such is life. And I will now turn it over to Andrea for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Professor Zingales, and thank you, Professor Gertner, for being here, for sharing your knowledge and insight with us. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank all of you for attending today's virtual Harper Lecture and for helping us end our successful international summer series. A recording of today's program will be available on the Harper Lecture YouTube channel in September. And I also encourage you to be on the lookout for an announcement for our fall Harper Lecture series. We have some really exciting speakers planned, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for them. Thank you again. We'll see you soon, and you can now disconnect.